who I also know will give her own assessment of trade agreements. But more importantly, she's got some real world experiences, whether it's the Vancouver Olympics or other cases that she'll talk about, in terms of linking that world of trade policy, trade negotiation, trade law to the culture of public procurement, and how do you actually embed circularity, sustainability in a practical way in some of these big efforts and processes. So Sandra, over to you. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you too, and thanks, Jeff. Certainly at the WTO, we could do with some real clarity on linking the WTO to the UN SDGs, and that's actually the focus of my PhD. So I'd love to hear Jeff saying that. Thank you to everybody who's still with us. I think I'm between you and possibly lunch, so let's try and keep this as interesting as we can. International trade agreements, friend or foe of the circular economy? Well, free open world trade and global competition conducted under the rule of law is the best way to stimulate economic growth and raise living standards globally. This is the thinking that underpins our current economic system. But the landscape is beginning to change. Oh, but my slides aren't changing.
We might have to give you the permissions that we gave Jeff. So maybe Cedric or somebody on the back end can make those adjustments to allow you to move those slides forward.
There we go. All right, let me just see if my clicker is going to work. Yeah, okay, we're all set. So the landscape's changing, and there is a desire for governments to be a lot more proactive in shaping markets and in moving us away from that take, make, waste linear economy to a more circular and sustainable and I would say socially just economy. So I research public sector innovation, specifically the role of government procurement in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I find there are 4 themes arising in my research. And these are, I research among high-income countries. And these countries are the same countries that are signatory to the WTO GPA that Jeff has just introduced you to, and that many procurers will know, but not necessarily love. And the countries that are signatory to the GPA are shown here in green. The highest income countries in the world, where I would say they have the most responsibility to act as socially responsible, sustainable, circular buyers. So today I'm going to talk about theme 1 and the move towards mandatory sustainable public procurement. This is particularly relevant for today's conversation because if trade agreements were in fact barriers, this trend couldn't be happening. So let me start with my own story. And this is very much, to quote Joanne, this is a human change management story. And it's about social procurement, which I think took a very similar journey as we are now starting with circular. In 2003, I had the opportunity to work on the Vancouver Olympic bid. Vancouver was the first Olympics in history to embrace sustainability, including the social aspect of sustainability. It was about people, planet, and profit, and sustainability was defined as doing the right thing. It was here that I first encountered the concept of social procurement that proactively designed and leveraged existing spend to improve lives. And by the end of the Games, I was John Furlong's business manager, and John Furlong was the CEO of the Vancouver 2010 Olympics. He wrote a book, and we crisscrossed Canada talking about the legacy of Vancouver 2010. And as I heard about social procurement and the impact that it had had, I began to ask governments why taxpayer-funded contracts were not also being leveraged to improve lives. And time again, I heard, oh, Sandra, that's illegal. Now, VANOC could do it because the Olympics is a non-profit organization, but we're government, and we have rules, we have trade agreements that stop us from doing that. I couldn't accept this. I could not accept that we would be signing trade agreements that would stop us improving people's lives. So I went on to create and then graduate as Canada's first social MBA. And I studied the trade agreements and the role of business in society and the role of governments in rewarding the most responsible and sustainable market actors. By 2014, I was speaking regularly on the topic, and I started to work with local governments in BC, Alberta, and Ontario to design Canada's first social procurement frameworks. And I'm happy to say that one of the mayors, Josie Osborne, that I worked with on Vancouver Island is now the BC Minister of Municipalities. And she is proactively supporting the expansion of social procurement across British Columbia. Knowledge from Vancouver Olympics transferred to London 2012 and to the Glasgow Commonwealth Games. And this year, the UK became the first country in the world to mandate the evaluation of social value in central government procurement, all central government procurement, including defence, with a required minimum of a 10% weighting, and interestingly, no maximum weighting. And I can tell you that not one word has changed in the WTO Government Procurement Agreement between 2012 and today. The point here is that international trade agreements had absolutely nothing to do with making this change happen. And that's where I think we are today with circular procurement. In this presentation, I will argue that our institutional norms and mindsets pose a much bigger barrier to change than do the trade agreements. But does that mean that international law and the trade agreements have absolutely no role to play in shaping a more sustainable approach to government procurement? That's certainly not. We're in a climate crisis, a COVID crisis. We have a crisis of inequality. We have a role to play. We all have a role to play. It has to be all hands on deck. So first, a little history. How did we get here? What, in fact, is the point of trade agreements? Well, interestingly for Canadians, it started in Newfoundland in 1941 with the signing of the Atlantic Charter. Churchill did not sail across the Atlantic in the middle of the Second World War to make public procurement more difficult. No, it was the desire for peace and the hope for a better world that underpins our current economic system. It's the idea that closer trading ties across a free and open world will bring us all closer together, stimulate productivity, and drive economic growth, raising living standards. This was the tide that would lift all boats and prevent future wars. But now we're starting to ask, what's growth for? Surely economic growth is pointless if people are not thriving, says Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. Many would say we've created a society in service of the economy, when what is needed is an economy in service of society. So all countries have signed on to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 12.7 calls for all nations to promote public procurement practices that are sustainable and in accordance with national policies and priorities. So to advance circular procurement, the very first thing that we need to know is this in fact a national priority? Do we have a clear mandate, national, provincial, state level, or municipal, to actually do this? Because without that clear mandate, it is very difficult to change organizational cultures and collaborate to establish new routines. Never underestimate the importance of clarity. This is the UK government's framework. It is mandatory to apply at least 10% value to support one of these 5 themes and 8 policy objectives. This mandatory and clear enabling framework is not yet in place in Canada, or to my knowledge, in the United States. But that's not the fault of the international trade agreements. That's a lack of political will and coordination between national and subnational governments. So public procurement has a massive potential to drive change. But we are not there yet. As I have said, it is still an underutilized mechanism. We know that every purchase has a consequence that can be positive or negative. And how far into the 21st century will it be before all public procurement in high-income countries must consider, and we move away from this language of may, but must consider the impact on people and planet. So back to the trade agreements. Are they friend or foe in a circular economy? When you talk about trade agreements and government procurement, you have to start with the WTO's government procurement agreement. provides the rules and dispute mechanism for 1.7 trillion in trade across 48 high-income countries. So if you conduct a search of the text of this agreement, you will find only one mention of green, and that refers to this photograph on the cover. And the word sustainable appears only 3 times in the entire document. Twice in this paragraph that you can see on this slide, and one mention referring to a commitment made 9 years ago to establish a working group to study sustainable public procurement. The world of international governance moves very slowly. Unsurprisingly, the word circular has yet to appear. So the GPA provides a model template, a starting point, if you like, for states to negotiate preferred terms for government procurement in regional trade agreements like CETA and the new NAFTA, where you will typically find that the chapter regarding government procurement is actually a cut and paste of this document. So it's an important starting point. If the countries can't negotiate anything better, then the GPA provides the default terms of access for government procurement markets. And essentially, the text that you see in this document today was created and in place in 2006. So given that it's now 15 years old and has yet to embrace sustainable public procurement, it's unrealistic to expect international governance to lead the way on advancing circular procurement. So the GPA exists primarily to advance procedural fairness, to stamp out corruption in government procurement, and to standardize the international rules regarding fair and reciprocal access to government procurement markets. That all sounds entirely reasonable to me, and I don't see any barriers at all being presented there. Now let's combine the objectives of the WTO GPA with the vision of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And there is certainly lots of interest in this topic. I've spoken twice at the WTO, once in 2017 on the importance of people in a people, planet, profit approach to sustainability, and again just last month, where the WTO itself was asking if international trade rules support or hinder countries in advancing green public procurement. And for those interested, a recording of that session is available on the WTO website and also on YouTube. At the heart of the debate is whether or not mandating sustainable public procurement at the international level may present a barrier to trade for developing countries. So what is stopping the richest countries moving forward to mandate sustainable public procurement is the concern that it will be a trade barrier for developing countries. And I think we can do both. I think we can have leadership from government procurement with the wealthiest high-income countries, and we can have a transitionary approach for developing countries wanting to have open, fair, non-corrupt government access or market access to their government procurement. But we're not there yet, and that shouldn't stop national governments, and certainly not subnational governments, from moving forward. The GPA provides a baseline. It's not the gold standard, and to address the climate crisis, the G7, and in fact all G20 countries, have a responsibility to go much further than a baseline. Many already do. So as Jeff has pointed out, we have the language in the GPA to support environmental and protection of human and plant health. So as long as you are providing equal, non-discriminatory treatment and running transparent processes that conform to the principles of proportionality and fair competition, you are free to determine how value will be defined. So how did we get here? Why do we keep hearing that trade agreements are a problem? As I said, it's much more related to culture and institutional norms that have been developed over the last 40 years. There are 3 distinct paradigms in public procurement. Up until the 1980s, public procurement had a long history of advancing societal objectives, but this was within primarily domestic marketplaces, where we had, it was before we had long and integrated global supply chains. In 1987, just as the Brundtland Report came out, launching the Sustainable Development Agenda, Non-commercial criteria, that would be the green and social considerations we're thinking about today, were being prohibited as the UK, US, and Europe moved to prioritize the liberalization and globalization of government procurement. And in 1994, this is exactly the thinking that was incorporated into the WTO GPA. That established the low bid dominant culture and our understanding of the role of government procurement, that the best way to get value for taxpayers was to drive down prices globally. The 20 years between 1994 and 2014 represent most of the careers of our senior executives and procurement directors. And throughout that time, the trade agreements required that only commercial specs could be included and awards were made based primarily on lowest bid. So despite the rules changing in 2014, organizational culture is much more difficult to change, which is why we are now seeing governments adopt mandatory regimes to push the needle and nudge the procurement system to actually consider non-financial, social and environmental outcomes in procurement. Without mandatory legislation, clear policies and guidance, there is no pressure on a traditionally risk-adverse system to change. So today, essentially what we see is two camps in public procurement practitioners. First camp is, I'll do it when I have to, and nobody's told me I have to. Until then, leave me alone to continue buying exactly as I always have done. Or two, I really want to do better. I want to buy more sustainably, more socially responsibly. I want to incorporate circularity, but I'm unclear as to what is permitted. How far can I go? How best to proceed? And that's where Canada at both the federal and provincial level is falling behind the other G7 nations. So global leaders like Japan, the Netherlands, and the UK are advancing green, circular, and social value procurement through mandatory policies. Japan went to mandatory green public procurement in 2001 and has benefited now where they have the highest country level adoption of green public procurement of anywhere in the world, 70%, 95% at their central government level across 22 priority categories. So Japan has been doing this for 20 years. Germany and the Netherlands, you will find knowledge hubs serving all levels of government, multi-level, but building the capacity to foster competition on the basis of non-commercial, social, and environmental values. The Greening Government Initiative, led by Canada and the USA, is an excellent first of its kind collaboration, which is much needed because the US and Canada still have some catching up to do. Another sector with catching up to do is healthcare. And here, governments certainly have enough market dominance, enough market power to shape closed loop production and producer take-back strategies. Healthcare in the UK has also been slow to adopt the social value agenda. However, effective next year, the entire NHS system, which is worth £269 billion in total, that's not just procurement, that's the entire system, will voluntarily adopt the social value procurement agenda. So they will put a 10% score on net zero and social value weighting. They will also require that suppliers must have a carbon reduction plan in place to bid, not to be awarded the contract, but to even be considered as part of the bid. This is what it could look like if you had the political and executive leadership policies, legislation in place. So back to the trade agreements. You also need to know the thresholds, because often we are applying trade agreement thinking when the trade agreements don't even apply. So they kick in Canada in the subnational big market opportunity at 650,000 for goods and services and at 9.1 million for construction. And there are some sectors that are exempt. You also need to know which agreement applies. So if we're looking at CETA and CUSMA, which is the new NAFTA, CETA is Canada's relationship with the EU and now the UK. It covers all taxpayer-funded systems. There's a handful of exceptions, but really think of it as very, very broad coverage and scope. And you can look at annexes 19.1, 2, and 3 to see exactly what is covered in CETA, but it is the largest coverage of any trade agreement that Canada has signed. Now, if we look at the new NAFTA, which has 3 names in 3 countries, that does not cover government procurement between Canada and the US. Canada and the US could not negotiate any terms better than the WTO GPA. So the GPA is the default. As we consider new pathways forward, we need to understand that social value is demand-led. It is a very good step to shifting thinking in the system about how value is being defined. Green procurement is more of a supply and demand. You need to have the products in the marketplace. Yes, you can signal, but you can't actually buy them and to serve your immediate needs until they physically exist. And circular is co-created. It's more complex and requires multi-level, multi-actor collaboration. So to wrap up, are trade agreements friend or foe of the circular economy? They're almost irrelevant at this point. They exist to ensure procedural fairness. The leadership to advance circular procurement needs to come from national, provincial governments committed to advancing multi-level, multi-sector collaboration. If you are truly trying to design out waste, reduce carbon emissions, protect the environment, and achieve incremental social value that all companies can bid on equally, you will not face a problem with the international trade agreements. But if you are trying to be protectionist or localist under the guise of sustainability or circularity, then yes, the trade agreements, the international trade agreements are designed to cause you problems. Our international partners expect Canada to abide by the rules of international law, but I think most fair-minded Canadians increasingly expect our taxpayer-funded systems to be sustainable and responsible and fair, to represent Canadian values globally. International trade agreements can no longer be used as an excuse for inaction or to maintain business as usual. If we want to transition to a circular economy, publicly funded systems must be required to reward the principles of circularity. Likewise, if we want more socially responsible companies, social responsibility must be more meaningfully rewarded in all taxpayer-funded contracts. The voluntary approach has not worked, and the world's wealthiest countries must now be required to act. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today.
That was fantastic, Sandra. You certainly opened my eyes in many different ways in terms of how we think about the day-to-day aspects of public procurement and the relationships, the connections to international trade agreements. But more importantly, I think just the institutional norms and those mindsets, as you indicated, that have become so ingrained and so embedded in the way that we think about things. And so when we move to the Q&A session, which we're doing right now, and just given the time, I think I have sort of a really sort of targeted question for you, and then perhaps for Jeff. You know, when we think about those international norms, those mindsets, that organizational culture that has been created both at the federal level, you know, within the states and provinces, within local municipalities, when we think about those new routines that we have to create, it seems to me that there's a whole bunch of education, training toolkits that kind of need to sort of fill in the space, you know, to really get people thinking differently. You know, is that kind of a right assessment? Like, where do you see, how did the UK get to where it is today? How did Japan get to where it is today? You know, were there knowledge hubs created? Were there templates and guidelines created? Or was it just, you know, sort of legislation, policy at the national level, and everything just naturally cascaded down? Like, how do you create that new normal?
I'm delighted to say that it was actually Manchester and some of the major cities. This was a not This was not a top down. This was a bottom up from the cities. So cities are leading. Cities will continue to lead. But in all credit to the national government of the UK, but to Wales, I am actually Welsh, so I'm delighted to see the Welsh leadership here, and to Scotland. What has happened is the UK has embraced an agenda that came from the cities. And so Manchester today has probably got more experience of any city in the UK of operating under a mandatory social value public procurement regime. It has been in place since 2014. And so they have adopted new routines. But at the central government level, the UK government did pass the Social Value Act in 2013, and that started as a nudge. So it started as a must consider social value. And then now it has moved to, okay, you've had a few years to consider it. Now it must be evaluated in all central government. And for me, the fact that they included defense was fascinating, because as I think Jeff will acknowledge, usually defense is treated as very, very differently. And here it has not had a different approach at all. They've said, no, it's all in. So we've moved to mandatory. They have an academy. So to speak to the education, yes, you have to invest in helping people with this transition. And Canada is a small federal spend, huge subnational spend, aligning that, having a central knowledge hub as they have in the Netherlands, as they have in Germany, as they have in the UK, is going to be absolutely crucial, along with a required mandate, legislation, and guidance. So yeah, it has to be education as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think when I did the math just in the Great Lakes alone, 8 states, 2 provinces, 10% roughly, sort of a government procurement spend. That's 600 million, give or take, in terms of a spend. So I think there's a lot of momentum we can create just at the Great Lakes level that hopefully will nudge our federal partners. So thanks for that, Sandra. It's very, very eye-opening. And I guess, Jeff, for you,